Cool. How's it going, everyone? I'm Tom. Thanks for the intro, Danny. So yes, I'm an Ableton-certified trainer and sometime music producer. I create content around Ableton as well. I do a lot of online content under ELPHNT. And today I want to talk a bit about using chance and randomness to help you be creative, get out of creative blocks, and just do some generally pretty cool stuff in Ableton Live and sort of music making, broadly speaking. Can everyone hear me at the back, by the way? If you can't at any point, just stick your hand up and I'll make sure to speak up. First, just a quick show of hands. Who here is a live user, an Ableton Live user? Cool, that's pretty good. Second question, have any of you watched the video of the talk that I gave at DBS Bristol? A couple of you, cool. So some of the stuff that I'm going to be going through is similar to that, but there's a whole bunch of new things that I've added in as well to kind of expand upon that. But so the core idea of what I want to talk about is embracing randomness. And you'll see there's many different ways to create this randomness. And quite a key concept with randomness is that we don't just want complete randomness, we want sort of controlled randomness. We want to be able to almost be a curator and use the computer as some kind of accompanist, it's a really hard word to say, accompanist, to help us come up with material and ideas. And this could be whether maybe you're like me and you can't play a keyboard. I'm a drummer originally, so my rhythm is great, but my melody and harmony is terrible. And so I need a little bit of help coming up with that sort of stuff. Or maybe you're a complete wizard on the keyboard, but everyone from time to time just gets stuck and you need a little bit of help coming up with ideas. And so we can use the computer to create these ideas for us and then kind of be curators of those ideas and just choose the best bits that we want. So we'll look at a bunch of different techniques along the way, things like MIDI effects, Max for Live. We'll cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to start off with a particular technique that I like to use quite a lot to come up with ideas. So here I've got a sound, which maybe you can turn that up a little bit. Cool. So normally I might record this sound in with a MIDI keyboard or a push or a controller or whatever that happens to be, but I'm going to let Live do all the work for me. So what I'm going to do is create a new MIDI track. So Command-Shift-T. And one of the things that you can do in Ableton that's pretty cool is you can route signals around between different tracks, audio signals and MIDI signals as well. So on this MIDI track that I've created, you'll see I've got this option to send the MIDI data from this track to something else. So I can actually send it to any other track, MIDI track in Ableton. So I can send it to this track over here. And now if I arm this track and set this first one to monitor its input, I get the same result, not very exciting, but I'm playing MIDI notes on this second track and it's sending it to the first track. So MIDI's going out of this track into this track, triggering that synth. So what I can start to do is I can create a clip on this track. And inside that clip, I'm just going to put a single note. So that's going to send that note to this synth. So again, not particularly interesting. But what I can do now is I'm going to duplicate this track. So I've got a second track here. And let's just move this note somewhere else. Now remember that this track is also sending to that same track over here. So when I play this, both of these, you can see that both of these MIDI notes, whenever they trigger, they get sent to this track. So again, not particularly interesting. But what I can do with clips in Ableton in the session view is by default the clips are going to be a bar long and they're both just looping in sync. I've got two separate clips. But I can take the second clip and I can adjust the length of its loop. Maybe I'm going to make it a bar and 1 beat long. And what you're going to start to hear happening is these two notes are going to go out of phase with one another and create this sort of changing pattern that you can hear happening in the background. So let's go a bit further. I'll duplicate this again and create a third clip. And let's also set this to a completely different length and move that note around. I'm going to put a utility device or something on here just to crank up this gain a little bit so you can hear that nicely. Cool. So if you listen to what we've got going now, we've got this kind of semi-generative rhythm happening. So the note's a bit boring, we're going to deal with that in a moment. but the rhythm is constantly changing. So you can hear that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another MIDI track, and I'm going to take the output of all of these 3 MIDI tracks, and I'm going to send them to this new MIDI track that I've created. I'm just going to name this track here my bus, my MIDI bus. And I'll set its inputs, its monitoring to in, so it's going to monitor those notes, and then tell it to send to this synth here. So same thing. But what I can start to do now is I can process this MIDI data using Ableton's MIDI effects. So Ableton has a bunch of these built-in MIDI effects, which are really powerful tools for coming up with ideas and helping you create sort of beyond what you might be able to play normally. Because these just transform MIDI data, whether you're playing it in with the keyboard or generating it live and manipulating it there. So the first device that I'm particularly interested in is this one called Random. So I'll stick it on this bus. And what Random does is it takes any notes that pass through it. Just yell at me if my giant head's in the way as well. It takes any notes that pass through it and it randomizes their pitch based on this chance control over here. So when it's at 0%, nothing happens, they're not randomized. But when I increase this, every note that goes through there gets a random pitch. So it's kind of interesting. It's a bit atonal, but let's add another MIDI effect to it. I'm going to add this chord MIDI device. So the chord MIDI device, again, processes any MIDI data that passes through it, and you can, of course, chain all these MIDI devices. Just a kind of a little note here in live, what you'll notice is that if I go over to an audio track, like my synth, you'll see how it's got these little audio meters between the devices to let you know that there's audio signal running. But on a MIDI track, we have these little yellow MIDI meters that just tell us that there's MIDI data. So we've just got MIDI data all the way through, all the way to the end of this track. So we can keep processing it with MIDI effects. So on this chord effect, I can add additional notes to create some kind of chord. So I've taken those single notes that are being randomized, created a chord out of them. Still kind of completely atonal. We're just going to use the last MIDI effect for now, called scale. So scale, I'm sure you've all probably seen this before in Ableton, because it's any non-musician's best friend in Ableton is the scale device. Because the way it works is you've got a bunch of different presets in here for different scale types. So I'm sure you all know when you're writing music, you want to be in a particular scale or a key to kind of have a consistent sound, like a minor or a major. So we can choose from all these different scale types. I'll go with C minor. And any MIDI notes that get passed through here conform to that particular scale. So it's going to sound a little bit more in key. So it sounds a little more pleasant, a little less atonal. Then the cool thing about all of this is that this track that's got our instrument on it, it just sees all of these MIDI inputs as regular MIDI, as if it was coming from a keyboard that I was playing. So what I can do now is I can arm this track and I can hit record, and it's just going to record in all this MIDI data for me. And let that run for a little while. Just capture a bunch of chords. Cool, so let's stop that. And so what I've done here is just using some simple MIDI notes. So these are just all the notes of C3, transform them with these MIDI effects to create some interesting patterns in the key of C minor. And then I've captured all of those patterns. Now, again, this is still quite random, and when we're making music, we usually want to have some kind of repetition or a pattern that we can use. So what we can do with this recording now is we can go in here and just start choosing sections of it. So I can grab a section of this loop, and I need to turn my monitor back to auto so that I can monitor from the clip. And I've got a series of chord progressions. I can choose shorter ones, longer ones. Maybe I'm going to just transpose these down an octave. Let's keep it short for now. And because this is just MIDI data, I can work with this in the same way I would normally work with MIDI. I can transform it further. If I kind of like the notes, but maybe I don't like the positioning of them, I can move the MIDI notes around because it's just MIDI data. So all I've done is I've used Ableton and the MIDI effects in Ableton to generate these ideas and then kind of curate the bits that I like from them. So I've got some chords here. We'll come back to those in a moment. We can do a similar thing for drums as well, drums or percussion. I'm just going to stick these in a group for now so we can hide those away and load up a drum sound. That's going to be quite loud. Cool. So I've got a drum kit. I can take a similar approach to creating drums. I'll go through this quite quickly because it's very much the same concept. Create a MIDI track. Maybe I'll call this one my kick. And on my MIDI 2, send that to the drums. I want to make sure my monitor's on in or that the track is record armed. I'll just leave it like that. And then I can create a clip in here. And let's just program in a pattern. And right off the bat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the length of this loop. So kind of quite a key part of this setup is these polyrhythms, these loops that have different lengths, because that's where you're going to get those interesting timing offsets. And you'll see as well, polyrhythms are going to be a theme that comes up quite a lot, is using timing offsets to kind of generate new things and new ideas, and we'll use that in other areas as well. So I'll send a kick drum. Let's maybe put a hi-hat in here. I've got to set my output. Just kind of draw on a hi-hat pattern and make it a bit shorter. You're going to start to hear I'm going to get a very generative kind of drum pattern happening. So maybe we've got the snare. What I find with a lot of these things is, so we're going to record this drum pattern in a while and we can choose a more consistent loop. But what you can do with drums is if you have one element that is consistent, so one element that sort of sticks to your regular 4/4 time, to anchor the beat in that time, you can have these kind of polyrhythmic things going over the top but still maintain that feel. So what I can do is I'm just going to leave this one. I'll use a snare drum because it gives us quite a strong anchor, or like this rim. And I'm just going to leave it in 4/4 on the 2 and the 4. So that's going to keep that anchor going. But that kick and that hi-hat over the top are just creating this constantly changing and evolving pattern. And again, in the same way as we did with that synth, if I wanted to, I could just record this in. And get down a pattern that I like, go in here, select different segments. Got a more repeating loop. What's quite nice about this as well is when you get to arrangement is because these parts are kind of related to one another, you can often just grab like the second half as a variation. So you'll switch to that maybe for your verse, you have one drum beat for your chorus, same with the chord patterns. So we've got some drums going. So the key there, polyrhythms and feeding MIDI between tracks in Ableton. So one of the other tools that is absolutely awesome for this kind of thing and coming up with ideas, generating random patterns, is Max for Live. So are there any Max for Live users here? Anyone who doesn't know what Max for Live is? Totally fine. So everyone understands what Max for Live. Don't need me to explain what Max for Live is. Cool. So Max for Live has got a ton of devices available. There's audio effects, MIDI effects, instruments, but the MIDI effects in particular, there's quite a few of them, can be really interesting for helping you come up with ideas. So there's one in particular that I really love using, and it is called the MDD Snake device. So this is quite a cool device. It's actually modeled on a piece of Eurorack hardware by Make Noise, I think it's, can't remember what the actual hardware is called. But so it's modeled on a piece of Eurorack hardware, but it generates note data. So we've got chords, we've got drums, let's go for a bass line. I'm going to grab another sound. Just drop that on there. Cool, let's just turn this off for now. So the way this device works, which is pretty fun, is I've got this random all button just over there behind me. The device feeds out notes, so pitch data, feeds out gates, which are on and off, so basically just like a note playing an actual note, velocity data, and then this custom data that we can map to something as well. And when I hit random all, it just completely randomizes all of that. So it's going to be quite loud. Let's get myself a random pattern. Hit it again, another random pattern. What I want to do though, again, this is just kind of not in any particular key. So I'm going to grab my scale device, my C minor, just to make sure everything's working in my same key. And it's also got those sort of screechingly high notes, which we want a bit of a bass line. So what we can do is just restrict the range of the randomization. And again, this is something that you'll want to pay attention to a lot when using randomization, is having some control over it. So we don't just want a complete random range of notes in any key. We want to kind of choose our key and select only the lower notes here. Pretty cool bass line. And just hit random, just generate a bunch of bass lines. It's kind of a cool one, I'll go with that one. So the sequencer generates those notes in real time. So if I were to turn this off, I get no notes. So you can use the same routing if you wanted to record those MIDI notes. I could set up another MIDI track and just tell it to either receive MIDI from that bass track, or I could route that track to send its MIDI, and I can record what's coming out of that bass track. So I've got that there. I can turn that off. I've got my bass line. But we're going to leave it, we'll leave it to run. I'll keep that MIDI clip over there, but we're going to leave it to run in real time because I want to use this for something else as well. So the bass line's going to run in real time. So far we've just been generating notes, but one of the things that we can use randomization for in an interesting way is to change the character of the sound itself as well. Because at the moment we've got this pattern of notes, but the sound's pretty constant. So maybe we want to have a slightly evolving sound as well. So for example, in the Snake device, we've got this custom sequence. So I'm sure if you've used Max for Live before, you might have come across devices like this. Max for Live has a bunch of different devices that let you map to controls in Ableton Live. So what I can do is I can hit this map button and click on a control, and you'll see that's kind of grayed out because it's now under the control of this device. And when I hit play, what you'll see is going to happen. Notice how that control is being sequenced by this sequence here. Got this slightly evolving pattern, which is pretty cool. Let's bring these drums back in. So let's go for something interesting on the drum part as well. We're going to use the same concept to add some kind of randomization to the sound. So one thing I could maybe change in this drum pattern, just to add a bit of interest to the sound, is the tone of the hi-hat. Let's have it shifting a little bit as it plays through the clip. So this particular drum rack that I've got set up here, I've got some controls that I can use to manipulate the hi-hat. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move that hi-hat note to the open hi-hat, and you'll see why in a moment. So I've got a bit more control over this decay of the hi-hat. So we're going to use another cool feature in Ableton Live called clip envelopes. I'm sure you've probably all come across clip envelopes before, and you might have used them, but we're going to come back to this concept of polyrhythms as well. So what I can do, and what you might have done before, is if I right-click on this control and say show automation, brings up the clip, and I can draw in some automation for this control. So you can hear that the decay of that hi-hat is changing. But again, that's sort of stuck to this 4-beat loop, or 2-bar loop, should I say. So it's going to be the same every time it loops around. But what we can actually do with these clip envelopes is you can have these be polyrhythmic as well. So in the envelope section, which is this section over here, if it's not visible, you've got a little button down here that hides and shows. Sorry, my head's right in the way of the... Seems to be a lot of stuff that happens in that corner, very conveniently. So that's where you show and hide the envelopes, down in that bottom corner. And that brings up this section here called the envelopes box. And in the envelopes box, by default, the loop of the envelope is going to be linked to the loop of the clip. So if my clip is 2 bars long, my envelope is going to be 2 bars long, whatever that happens to be. But if I hit that, you'll notice that the notes have disappeared. They're still there. They're in this other notes section. But now this envelope has its own independent loop. And I can set that to be at an odd length, something that's different to the length of the clip. You're going to start to hear how the feel of the pattern isn't completely in sync with the actual notes of the pattern. So you get this kind of sound feel that changes over time as well. Maybe let's do that with something else. Let's go to this kick drum and let's do something really weird. This particular drum rack that I've got set up lets you change the sample, which is kind of interesting. So I'll right click on that and say show automation. And again, just straight away, I'm going to click this unlinked button and let's set a sort of a short loop here and just draw in something kind of weird. I got this kind of interesting pattern going. Cool, everyone kind of following along so far? If there's any questions at any point, by the way, just stick your hand up and we can deal with them then and there. So yeah, feel free to stick your hand up if you've got any questions. Cool, so I'm going to add another part to this track. If I remember correctly, these chords, I wasn't totally happy with them, so I'm going to create maybe a different kind of melodic pattern. Let's just listen. Yeah, let's create something different for the melody. And I'm going to use another Max for Live device. Has anyone used the CV Tools Max for Live pack? Not yet, but want to? Cool. So some of you might not have used it because you think, oh, CV Tools, I don't have any modular gear. I can't make use of it. But there's actually some really cool devices in it that you can use without modular gear. So I'm going to head over to the pack. Let's open up my track here. Grab CV Tools. Under the CV Instruments category, you have this thing called the Rotating Rhythm Generator. I'm going to drop that on the track. Anyone heard of Euclidean rhythms? I'm going to get mathematical for a second. So Euclid was a way old dude from Greece who came up with these mathematical concepts about evenly distributing numbers within a particular pattern. That has absolutely no relevance to what we're doing, but it's his namesake that we're using for Euclidean rhythms. But this is another really cool technique that you can use for generating these patterns. Also, just to point out at this stage, I'm going completely extreme with this and doing it for absolutely every element of the track, which gives you quite a sort of random feeling track, which maybe that works if you're going for like an Aphex Twin kind of vibe. But you absolutely don't have to. You can use this for just your drums or just your chords or individual parts. So just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm kind of going a bit nuts with it and showing you all these different options. So back to the rotating rhythm generator. The way this works is we've got 4 essentially rhythms that we can work with that generate notes. I'm just going to start with the first one. So that's generating a bunch of MIDI notes that's sending to this synth. At the moment, it's generating them at 16th note divisions. So this is just sort of pretty standard, generates those notes. So that's not particularly interesting, not really what I want to look at. But at the bottom of this, again, this bottom left corner is just where everything seems to happen over there. I've got this option here for where it says Euclid, for Euclidean rhythms. And the way this works is there's two elements to Euclidean rhythm. There's the steps and the fills. The steps is essentially how long your pattern is. So let's say 8 beats. So my total pattern is going to happen over 8 beats. The second number is how many notes I want to occur in those 8 beats. So if I have 8, 8, I'm going to get a note on every single beat. At my quarter notes. Let's go 8th notes. But if you change this to a number that's less than the number of steps, the way Euclidean rhythms works is there's some kind of complicated algorithm in the background going on that evenly distributes those steps. So 5 steps, it evenly distributes them among the 8 total stages that I've got. So in 8 beats, there's going to be 5 notes, and you hear how it's created this rhythm. Let's maybe make it, set it to 3. In a length of 8 beats, I'm going to get 3 notes. So whatever number you set it to, I'm going to get 7. You can see I'm getting 7 notes in those 8 beats. And I can start to add some different patterns to this. So we've got 4 different rhythms that we can generate. So let's leave this one at like 8, 3. And I'm going to turn the second one on, go to Euclid. Let's go 8, 5. And immediately you can hear there's those 2 parallel rhythms running. So there's this one. It's got 5 notes in 8 over 3 and 8. So again, there's that idea of sort of polyrhythms happening. So we can build up some kind of chordal stuff. Let's bring in another one here. Maybe do 7. But really interesting things start to happen with these Euclidean rhythms when you make the number of steps, the length of the bar, again we're going for these odd lengths, something different. So maybe I'll make this 9, 11, and 13. You get all these patterns happening over one another. So that can be really interesting for drums as well. I'll just drop this device on the drum track just to demonstrate that. I have to set these to be the right notes. So here, I can set 5 notes in the space of 8. These work particularly well for drums. You get these really interesting non-repetitive patterns happening. Let's find the right. Often you'll actually find a lot of these Euclidean rhythms, because of their polyrhythms, they have a lot of resemblance to sort of African rhythms. So if you're into those kind of really polyrhythmic, offbeat kind of African feels, you can get some really interesting results with these Euclidean rhythms. Cool. So let's look at a few more ways of using kind of chance to get inspired for sound design as well. So far I've just been working with some MIDI data. One thing that I find kind of has a chance element to it that helps me come up with ideas and sort of give me new ideas is working with field recordings. Anyone do any field recording? cool. If you don't, I'd really recommend getting into it. It's pretty fun. You can just take your phone, go record a bunch of sounds out in the world. Because you can get some really interesting results, particularly with rhythms, but with melodic and sort of chordal elements as well. So I've got this sample here that I recorded in my kitchen. Just a bunch of clanking, some water. I'll just play a little section of it. Some water sounds in there. You get the idea. So in Ableton we have a device called the Simpler. I'm sure you've probably all come across the Simpler, probably used it as well. Simpler is really great for working with samples. So I can take this sample that I've got and just drop it straight into the Simpler. In particular, I'm interested, again, bottom left corner is just killing me today, in this thing called slice mode. So what slice mode does is it analyzes the audio file and looks for transients, where there's short little spikes in the signal. And that's usually where there's going to be something percussive, which obviously is going to be great for rhythm. So like a little hit of something metal, or one of the bubbles of the water going down the drain. So I've got all these little slices over here, and I can start to trigger those. But again, let's just lean into this randomness. Let's trigger these kind of randomly, and let's look at some other ways to generate these random patterns. So going back to our MIDI effects, a MIDI effect you've probably all used before, but maybe not in this way, is the Arpeggiator device. So I'm going to stick that in front of our instrument. So the Arpeggiator, I'm sure you're all familiar. If I play multiple notes, it creates an arpeggio. So it plays them, instead of playing them all together like a chord, plays them one after the other. That's already kind of pretty interesting. So I could maybe capture that, and that would be a pretty interesting pattern. But again, let's use some more of these MIDI effects to do something interesting. I'm a really lazy music producer. I don't like to do too much. I want the computer to do everything for me. So I want to be able to just play one note and have a whole bunch of interesting stuff happen. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this chord device and I'm going to add some chords here. Now, because we're working with percussion, it doesn't really matter what I put in here. And I'm not going to need that scale device like before. But that's just going to take a single note that I'm going to play and create a chord with that. So I can start to create some rhythms with it. In the Arpeggiator, you've got some random styles. So I can say random, and it's going to move through the notes that I play, but in a random order. Let's maybe change the rate of this. Within the random settings in the Arpeggiator, the one that I find kind of the most useful for coming up with musical ideas is this random once option. What that does is it puts them in a random order, but only once. It doesn't randomize it every time it comes around. You can hear how that random order that it comes with, every time I trigger a new note, it restarts it, but it stays in that random order. So I can just go in here and plug in a single note, because I'm super lazy, and maybe, in fact, I'm just going to leave that note there, and again, let's go with our friend random over here, and it's just going to generate a bunch of these random, interesting little rhythmic patterns for us. Again, just to reiterate, quite a key part of this random generation of ideas is to be able to capture bits and pieces that you like so that you can just choose the best bits, because we might not want that just kind of constantly generating in the background. So I've shown you how to do that with MIDI, how you can recapture MIDI from another track. You can do the same thing with audio as well. So if I create a blank audio track here, I can tell it to receive its audio from this kitchen track. And I can just capture a little bit of that randomness. Oh, that last one was kind of nice, but it stopped recording. And then just use little bits of that. It's kind of an interesting sort of shaker pattern, might go quite nicely with our drums. Oh, I think we've got too much randomness happening now. So we'll take off the rotating rhythm generator, just go with the drums. Adding kind of a nice sort of shuffly feel to it. So all of those patterns have just been generated by the computer. I didn't do any writing today. I wasn't feeling particularly inspired when I sat down, didn't have any melodies in my head, any rhythms. So those have just all been generated for me, and I've chosen the best bits from the ones that I like. Again, going back to Max for Live, one problem I have a lot with drum tracks in particular, programmed drum tracks, is they can get very stale very quickly. They can get very repetitive, and I often get stuck trying to come up with longer patterns that have kind of changing feels to them. So there's some cool ways that you can deal with this with MIDI effects with Max for Live. So one simple way is using Live's velocity MIDI effect. So I'm one of those really nerdy people that gets excited whenever I see just the word random, because I know I can do some cool stuff with it. So the velocity MIDI effect has got this random control in it. And what that does is, I'll just crank it full so you can hear. Let's make sure I've got. It randomizes the velocity of the notes that get sent to it. So these are all the same velocity, but you can hear they're being randomized. It's quite extreme at this point, but kind of creates that interesting sort of push-pull feel of the groove, which is pretty cool. So this is something I use all the time for, particularly for drum grooves, to bring a little bit of life to them. It's another area where you can use some randomness. Another really cool set of Max for Live devices is a set of Max for Live devices called Chance 10. So these are 10 devices that use chance and randomness to process MIDI data. So you can just Google these and you'll find them online. This first one is called Play. The way this works is you set a percentage chance that any note that goes through that device is going to be triggered. So at 100%, every note gets triggered. We get our full beats. Anything less than that, so let's go 50%. 50% of our notes, okay, we'll go 51, aren't going to be triggered. So you can hear that. So immediately we've got this sort of non-repetitive, the feel is still there, but it's kind of changing every time, as if it was maybe like a real drummer playing it, which is pretty cool. And again, we can capture all of this randomness. Again, sticking with our theme of Max for Live, there's plenty of stuff to be found with Max for Live. There's a couple other control devices that we can use to randomize things. So you have this device called the LFO. Anyone who's worked in the world of sort of modular synthesis, you'll be familiar with using LFOs and modulators to create these changing patterns and unsynced patterns and polyrhythms and things with randomness. It's very common in the modular space. So with Max for Live, you can kind of bring that idea into Live as well. So what this allows you to do is to modulate parameters. So for example, we can do something similar that we did earlier. If you remember, we had our hi-hat. I I can take this LFO and I can map it to a control. See how that's being modulated. But I can change this to a random pattern, and maybe let's have it. But what's quite cool about the LFO is you can actually have multiple things being modulated by the single LFO. Maybe let's restrict the range a little bit. I'm going to turn this play off. Just making that beat just a little bit more interesting. Cool. So, there's one thing that you can take away from today is there's a number of different places that you can sort of inject some of this randomness into your production. The idea isn't to put it everywhere unless you absolutely want to and want to go for something completely atonal and weird and arrhythmic. But just bringing it in lots of little different areas can help you to spice up your drum beat a bit, come up with new chord patterns, come up with an interesting bass line, come up with an evolving, changing sound. And you can use it either when you are stuck for ideas and you just need a little bit of help, or you can kind of just use it as a way to inject a bit of life and sort of humanization into your parts. So just to quickly recap, we can use the MIDI generators to generate random MIDI notes and capture those. Key idea, just capturing the randomness. We can use Max for Live devices. There's Max for Live devices like the Snake sequencer, which you can use. You can use Max for Live devices like the LFO. We've got the rotating rhythm generator, which again, that's just free in the CB Tools pack. So check that out, and you can do Euclidean rhythms. And we can use things like follow actions as well to help with tasks like arrangements. And that's just one very small use of follow actions. But as soon as you start thinking about these things of how can I implement randomness in interesting ways, what you'll discover is that you'll find all sorts of interesting ways to use them. So that's one very specific way of using follow actions to inject some randomness into the arrangement. But as some of you mentioned, you can use follow actions to randomly slice up clips. You can use follow actions to create new ideas as well by chaining multiple parts together and jumping between them. So I'm going to leave you with that, and that sort of intention is to go away now and next time you sit down to make music is see what areas you can find that have some randomness. And there's tons more in Ableton that I didn't even touch on. And just start to bring a little bit of that into your production. And then remember to just capture it, choose the bits that you like, and go from there. Thank you very much.